My husband knew exactly when people would die. I should have asked how he knew. I met my husband Wick at a bar when I was 26. He was quiet, tall, and had the kind of face that looked like it was always thinking about something far away. We dated for 8 months and got married in a courthouse on a Tuesday. He didn't want a big wedding. He said he'd already seen how it turned out and it was better this way. I thought he was being funny. He wasn't. About 3 months into our marriage, Wick told me something I didn't know how to respond to. We were sitting in bed on a Sunday night and he looked at me and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not panic." I said, "Okay." He said he wasn't from this time. He said he was from 11 years in the future and that he had been sent back for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He said the world he came from was falling apart and that certain people had been given the ability to return to a fixed point in the past. He said he chose this year because this was the year he met me. I didn't believe him. I thought he was having a breakdown. I asked him if he was feeling okay. He said he would prove it. He told me that on Wednesday of that week, a man named Orrin Gillis in our town would die of a heart attack in the parking lot of a hardware store at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. He said it calmly, the way someone reads a grocery list. On Wednesday, I looked it up. Orrin Gillis, 58 years old, died of cardiac arrest in the parking lot of a hardware store. Time of death was listed as 2:20 p.m. I felt something in my chest drop. I went home and looked at Wick and didn't know what to say. He said, "I told you." Over the next 6 months, Wick told me about 4 more deaths before they happened. A woman named Delia Marsh who would drown in a lake during a weekend trip. A man named Voss Kelly who would fall off a roof while cleaning his gutters. A teenager named Juno Park who would be hit by a car on a Tuesday evening. An older man named Seward Crisp who would die in his sleep on a Friday in November. Every single one happened exactly as Wick described. The dates, the locations, the causes. He was never wrong. Not once. I stopped questioning whether he was from the future. I started living with it like it was just part of who he was. He knew things. He knew when people were going to die. He carried that weight and I respected it. He said he couldn't change any of it. He said the deaths were fixed points that had to happen and that interfering would make things worse. I asked him once if he knew when I would die. He said no. He said the people he loved were blind spots. He said that's what made it bearable. I accepted that too. For 2 years, I accepted everything he told me. Then last March, something changed. Wick told me a woman named Pia Langford would die in a car accident on Route 9 on a Thursday at around 6 p.m. He said it the same way he always did. But that night after he went to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't know why this one felt different. Maybe it was the name. Maybe it was because she was young, 32, and I'd seen her face in a local community page and she had 2 kids. Something about this one made me sick. On Thursday, I drove out to Route 9 at 5 p.m. I parked on a side road about a quarter mile from the spot Wick described. I told myself I just wanted to see. I didn't know what I was looking for. At 5:48 p.m., I saw Wick's truck. It was parked on a dirt pull-off about 200 yards from the intersection. He was sitting inside with the engine off. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting, watching the road. At 5:55, a silver car came up Route 9 heading east. It was moving at normal speed. Then a second car pulled out from a side road and cut across the lane. The silver car swerved, went off the road, hit a ditch, and rolled. I watched it happen from where I was parked. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I looked back at Wick's truck. He started the engine, pulled off the dirt, and drove away. He didn't call anyone. He didn't stop. He just left. The silver car was Pia Langford's. She died at the scene. The second car that pulled out never stopped. I drove home in a fog. Wick was already there when I arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen table eating leftovers. He looked up and said, "Long day." I said yes. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Wick I needed to visit my sister for a few days. He said okay. I drove to my sister Nell's house and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said he's not predicting them. I said I know. She said he's there when it happens, every time. I said I know. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know. But I knew I couldn't go back to that house and sit across from him and eat dinner like nothing was wrong. Nell helped me find a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer. A criminal lawyer. His name was Bram Holt, and he worked out of a small office above a bakery in the next town over. He was older, maybe mid-60s, and he had the kind of face that had heard everything. I sat in his office and told him the whole story from the beginning. The time travel claim, the predictions, the deaths, Pia Langford on Route 9, Wick's truck parked on the dirt pull-off 200 yards away, the second car that never stopped. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long time. He said the time travel part is not something I can work with, but a man who knows when and where people are going to die and is present at the scene when it happens, that I can work with. He asked me how many deaths Wick had predicted. I said at least 6 that I knew about. He asked me if Wick had ever mentioned others before we were married. I said I didn't know. He said that was the first thing we needed to find out. Bram told me to go home. He said to act normal. He said not to confront Wick, not to change my routine, and not to let him suspect anything. He said the most important thing I could do was pay attention. Write down everything. Dates, names, things Wick said, places he went, times he left the house, and times he came back. He told me to get a small notebook and keep it somewhere Wick would never look. I went home 2 days later. Wick was sitting on the porch when I pulled into the driveway. He looked up and smiled and said he missed me. I said I missed him too. I walked inside and put my bag down and looked at the kitchen table where he had been eating leftovers the night Pia Langford died, and I felt my stomach turn. But I smiled and asked him what he wanted for dinner. That night while he slept, I started the notebook. I sat on the bathroom floor with the door locked and a pen in my hand and went through everything I could remember. Every name he had told me, every date, every detail about how and where each person would die. I wrote down Orrin Gillis, hardware store, heart attack, Wednesday, 2:15 p.m., Delia Marsh, lake, drowning, weekend, Voss Kelly, roof, fall, gutters, Juno Park, hit by car, Tuesday evening, Seward Crisp, died in sleep, Friday, November, Pia Langford, Route 9, car accident, Thursday, 6 p.m., 6 names, 6 deaths, all exactly as he described. Then I wrote down everything else I could think of, the times he left the house before each death, the way his mood would shift in the days leading up to one. He would get quieter than usual. He'd stop making eye contact during meals. He'd stand at the kitchen window at night looking at nothing. I had always interpreted that as the weight of knowing, the burden of seeing the future. Now I understood it differently. I hid the notebook inside a box of winter clothes in the hallway closet. Over the next 4 weeks, I watched Wick more carefully than I had ever watched anyone in my life. I noticed things I had missed before. He left the house at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon for 20 or 30 minutes with no explanation. He'd come back and say he went for a drive or stopped for coffee, but there was never a cup in the car. He got phone calls he took in the garage with the door closed. He had a second phone. I found it in the glove compartment of his truck one morning after he left for work. It was a cheap prepaid phone with no case. I didn't open it. I wrote down the make and model and put it back exactly where I found it. I told Bram about the second phone. He said don't touch it again. He said he was going to contact someone. 2 weeks later, Bram introduced me to a detective named Tess Overton. She was with the state police and she had a calm, steady voice and eyes that didn't blink much. We met at Nell's house. I told Tess everything I had told Bram. She recorded the conversation. She asked me to repeat the names. I did. She wrote each one down in her own notebook and asked me to spell them. When I got to Juno Park, she paused. She looked up at me and said, "How old was Juno?" I said Wick told me she was 17. Tess nodded slowly and wrote something in the margin. She said the Juno Park case had been classified as a hit and run with no suspects. She said the driver was never found. She asked me if Wick ever described the second car in the Pia Langford accident. I said no. He only told me about Pia. He never mentioned another car. Tess looked at Bram. Bram looked at me. Nobody said anything for about 10 seconds. Then Tess said she was going to pull the files on every name I had given her and cross-reference the dates and locations with anything they had. She asked me to keep doing what I was doing. Keep writing in the notebook. Keep watching. Keep acting normal. She said the hardest part of what I was doing was the most important part. I went home and made dinner and sat across from Wick and watched him eat and tried not to think about the fact that 6 people were dead and my husband knew the exact minute each of them would stop breathing. 3 weeks later, Wick told me another name. We were in the car driving home from the grocery store and he said it the way he always did, flat and quiet like he was reading it off a page in front of him. He said a man named Collier Webb would die on the 14th of next month. He said it would happen at a construction site on the east side of town. He said a piece of equipment would fail. He said it would be fast. I didn't react. I nodded and said, okay. When we got home, I went to the bathroom and wrote it all down with shaking hands. I called Bram that night from Nell's phone. He called Tess. They asked me if I was willing to do one more thing. They asked me to follow Wick on the 14th. I said yes. On the 14th, I told Wick I was going to a dentist appointment. I drove to the east side of town and parked 3 blocks from the construction site. I waited. At 11:40 in the morning, I saw Wick's truck. He drove past the site slowly, turned at the next block, and parked on a dead-end street that ran along the back of the property. He sat in his truck with the engine off. At 11:55, I heard a sound I will never forget. Metal bending and then a crash and then yelling. A lot of yelling. I saw dust rise above the site fence. Workers were running. Someone was screaming for help. I looked at Wick's truck. He sat there for about 90 seconds. Then he started the engine and drove away. He didn't call 911. He didn't get out. He just watched and left. Collier Webb, 41, was killed when a crane cable snapped and dropped a steel beam onto the platform where he was standing. I found out later he had a wife and a daughter who was 8 months old. His wife's name was Gemma. I looked her up online after the funeral. She posted a photo of Collier holding the baby the day she was born. He was smiling with his whole face. The baby had his chin. I stared at that photo for a long time and thought about Wick sitting in his truck 3 blocks away watching the clock. I drove to Nell's house and sat in her driveway for 20 minutes before I could get out of the car. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't undo my seatbelt on the first try. Tess met me there an hour later. I told her everything. The truck on the dead-end street, the timing, the way he sat and watched and then left. She nodded and said, "That's 7. I said 7 what? She said 7 deaths where your husband had advanced knowledge and was present at or near the scene. She said that was enough. She asked me if I was ready. I said ready for what? She said ready for him to be arrested. I sat in Nell's kitchen and stared at the table and thought about the man I married in a courthouse on a Tuesday. The man who said he chose this year because it was the year he met me. The man who told me the people he loved were blind spots. The man who ate leftovers at our kitchen table while a woman named Pia Langford was being pulled from a wrecked car on Route 9. I said yes. They arrested Wick on a Thursday morning at 6 a.m. I wasn't home. I was at Nell's house. I had left the night before telling Wick I was helping Nell with some repairs at her place. He kissed me on the forehead before I left and said, "Drive safe." That was the last thing he ever said to me in person. Drive safe. Like he was a normal husband saying goodbye to his normal wife on a normal Wednesday night. Tess called me at 6:15 and said it was done. She said he didn't resist. She said when they told him what the charges were, he looked at the officers and said she figured it out. He meant me. He didn't say it with anger. Tess said he sounded almost impressed. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He sat in the interrogation room and Tess told me later that he was calm the entire time. He didn't confess to anything directly. He didn't repeat the time travel story. He said very little. But when Tess asked him how he knew about the deaths, he said I was in the right place at the right time. She asked him why he was at every single one. He said I just end up where things happen. She asked him about the second car on Route 9, the one that pulled out in front of Pia Langford and never stopped. He didn't answer. She asked him about the crane cable at the construction site, whether he had access to the property before the accident. He asked for a lawyer after that. The investigation took months. I cooperated with everything. I handed over the notebook. I gave recorded statements across 4 separate sessions, each one lasting 2 to 3 hours. I sat in rooms with detectives and prosecutors and told them about every conversation Wick and I ever had about the deaths, every name, every date, every detail he shared. I told them about the Sunday night in bed when he said he was from the future. I told them about the way he said the deaths were fixed points. I told them how he described each one with no emotion, no hesitation, like he was reporting the weather. Some of the prosecutors looked at me with pity. Some of them looked at me like they were trying to figure out how much I really knew and when I knew it. I understood that. I had lived with a man who killed people and I didn't see it. That raises questions about a person. I answered every one of them. The prepaid phone was recovered from his truck. It had call logs and messages that connected Wick to people and places tied to at least 4 of the 7 deaths. There were calls made within hours of each incident to numbers that led to other prepaid phones. Some of those phones were found. Some weren't. The picture that emerged was that Wick was not acting alone. There were other people involved. People who drove the second car on Route 9. People who had access to the construction site before the crane failed. Wick was the planner. He was the one who knew when and where, but he had help making it happen. The police found evidence that the crane cable at the construction site had been tampered with. A maintenance report filed the week before showed the cable had passed inspection, but a forensic engineer found tool marks on the cable housing that were consistent with deliberate weakening. Someone had cut into the cable just enough that it would hold for a while before snapping under load. Collier Webb never had a chance. They found that the second car on Route 9 was registered to a woman who didn't exist. The name on the registration was Linda Foss. The address was a vacant lot in a town 40 miles away. There was no driver's license, no social security number, no record of any person by that name ever existing in the state. The car was found abandoned in a field 2 counties over, wiped clean. Not a single fingerprint. They traced the VIN to a private sale paid for in cash 3 weeks before Pia Langford died. The seller described the buyer as a tall man who didn't talk much. He couldn't pick him out of a lineup, but the description matched Wick. Wick was charged with 2 counts of murder and 4 counts of accessory to homicide. The 7th death, Seward Crisp, the man who died in his sleep, was exhumed. The toxicology report came back positive for a substance that should not have been in his system. That became the 3rd murder charge. The trial hasn't started yet. Bram told me it will probably take another year before it goes to court. Wick hasn't contacted me. His public defender sent me a letter asking if I would be willing to speak with Wick as part of his case preparation. I declined. Nell asked me once if I thought any of the time travel story was real. We were sitting on her back porch in the dark drinking tea, and she asked it quietly like she had been thinking about it for a long time. I said no. She asked me what I thought it was. I said I think it was the most elaborate lie a person has ever told to make someone stop asking questions. And it worked. For 2 years it worked. He told me something so impossible that I focused on whether it was true instead of focusing on what he was actually doing. I spent 2 years marveling at his predictions instead of asking the only question that mattered. How did he know? That was the question I should have asked the very first time he said Orrin Gillis was going to die in a hardware store parking lot. Not when, not where, not how. How did you know? I filed for divorce 5 weeks after the arrest. It was uncontested. Wick signed the papers through his attorney without adding a single condition. No requests, no negotiation, no messages attached. Just his signature on every line. The divorce was finalized in less than 3 months, which is fast for this state. Bram said it was because there were no children, no shared debts, and the respondent was in jail awaiting trial for multiple homicides. He said that tends to simplify the paperwork. I got the house. I got everything in it. I didn't want any of it. Every object in that house had his fingerprints on it. Every room had a memory of him sitting or standing or sleeping in it while I thought I was married to a man who could see the future. I wasn't married to a man who could see the future. I was married to a man who decided the future and then told me about it like it was prophecy. I sold the house 2 months later and moved into an apartment near Nell. I got rid of the furniture, the dishes, the bed we shared, the kitchen table where he sat and ate leftovers while people died. I took everything to a donation center in 3 carloads. The woman at the counter said, "That's a lot of stuff. Are you moving?" I said something like that. I kept almost nothing. A few books, some clothes, a box of photos from before I met him so I could remember what my life looked like when it was just mine. Nell helped me set up the apartment. She brought a small table and 2 chairs and a lamp and a plant she said was impossible to kill. She didn't ask me if I was okay because she knew I wasn't, and she knew I didn't want to answer that question. She just showed up and helped me hang curtains, and then we sat on the floor eating takeout, and she told me about her week like everything was normal. That's what I needed. Normal. I work at a library now. It's quiet and the hours are steady, and nobody there knows anything about Wick or the trial or the 7 names in my notebook. My coworkers think I'm divorced. That's technically true. They don't know the rest. I shelve books and help people find what they're looking for and process returns, and sometimes I sit at the front desk during slow hours and read, and some days I don't think about it at all. Those are the good days. The bad days come without warning. A car backfires and I'm back on that side road watching Pia Langford's car roll into a ditch. Someone mentions a hardware store and I see Orrin Gillis falling in a parking lot. A crane passes on the highway and I have to pull over. Those days I call Nell and she talks to me until my breathing slows down. Someone asked me recently if I ever loved him. I thought about it for a while. I loved the man I thought he was. I loved the version of him that sat in bed on a Sunday night and told me something impossible because he trusted me. But that man didn't exist. That man was a character in a story Wick built around himself so I would stop looking at what was right in front of me. And I did stop looking. For 2 years I looked everywhere except where it mattered. That's the part I carry now, not what he did, what I didn't see.